Some gunslingers carried revolvers so feared, just seeing one was enough to end a fight. What made them so scary? We're diving into the history of these legendary firearms, revealing the one revolver so complicated to reload that it became a last resort for the most desperate of outlaws. 1. Colt Single Action Army. Everyone who has ever seen a Western movie knows this one. It's called the Peacemaker, and it was the king of all revolvers. This was the gun that every cowboy, lawman, and outlaw wanted. The Colt Single Action Army, or SAA for short, was strong, reliable, and it looked just plain cool. It was perfectly balanced, which made it easy to aim. When you hear stories about famous gunfighters like Wyatt Earp or Bat Masterson, you better believe this was the revolver they were probably carrying. It was the symbol of the American West. The thing is, the Peacemaker was so simple and tough, it almost never broke down. In a time when your life depended on your gear, that was a huge deal. But its simple design had one big drawback that could leave a gunslinger in a real tight spot. And that weakness led people to look for our next revolver, which tried to fix that exact problem. 2. Smith & Wesson, Model 3. So, what was the Peacemaker's big problem? It was slow to reload. You had to load and unload one bullet at a time. The Smith & Wesson Model 3, especially the version called the Schofield, fixed that with a clever trick. Instead of loading one by one, you could break the whole gun in half on a hinge. When you did that, all the empty bullet casings popped out at once. Then, you could drop in fresh bullets and snap it shut. It was way faster. Famous figures like Jesse James and even Wyatt Earp used a Schofield at some point. The U.S. Army bought a bunch too. It was a fantastic gun, and some say it was even better than the Colt. But its clever design also had a secret weakness. The hinge could wear out over time, making it wobbly. And if you think a wobbly gun is bad, wait until you hear about a revolver that was so big and powerful it was more like a small cannon. 3. Colt Walker. Let's travel back in time a bit before the Peacemaker. We're talking about the Colt Walker. This thing was a monster. It was the biggest, heaviest, most powerful black powder revolver ever made. A Texas Ranger named Samuel Walker helped design it, and he wanted a gun that could take down a person or even a horse from far away. And boy, did he get it. This revolver was a beast. It was so huge, you usually had to carry it in a saddle holster on your horse, not on your belt. The Walker was famous for its raw power. It packed such a punch that it could sometimes break itself when it was fired. Stories from back then say that the cylinders would sometimes blow apart. As it turns out, that much power was a little too much to handle. So, the next step was to make a gun that was almost as strong, but a whole lot safer. 4. Colt Dragoon. After the super powerful but sometimes dangerous Colt Walker, a new model came along. It was called the Colt Dragoon. Think of it as the Walker's slightly smaller, smarter, and safer younger brother. It was still a huge and heavy revolver designed for soldiers on horseback called dragoons. It had a lot of the Walker's power, but Colt made some improvements to make it more reliable and less likely to have a catastrophic failure. The Dragoon became super popular during the California Gold Rush, and with folks heading west, it was a tough, hard-hitting gun that you could count on. It was a real workhorse. It proved that a gun could be incredibly powerful without being a danger to the person firing it. But as good as it was still a beast to carry around. So, what did people who wanted a powerful but lighter gun do? Well, they turned to a revolver that was famous for its beautiful design. 5. Colt 1000 851 Navy. Now, get this. The Colt 1000 851 Navy was considered by many to be one of the most beautiful handguns ever made. It was lighter and better balanced than the big Dragoons. It was called the Navy because it had a scene of a naval battle engraved on the cylinder. But don't let the name fool you. It was way more popular on land than it ever was at sea. Cowboys, soldiers, and lawmen all loved it. A famous user was James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill Hickok. He carried a pair of them with ivory handles. The 1000 851 Navy was popular for a long time, even after newer guns came out. It just felt right in your hand. It was a perfect mix of power and good looks. But like all the guns we've talked about so far, it was a single-action revolver. That means you had to pull the hammer back with your thumb before every single shot. Our next revolver tried something completely different that changed gunfighting forever. 6. Star Double-Action Revolver. Imagine being in a tense situation where you need to get shots off fast. With a single-action gun, you have to cock the hammer each time. The Star Revolver tried to solve this with a new idea called double action. With a double-action gun, a long pull of the trigger does two things. It cocks the hammer and then releases it, firing the gun. This meant you could fire much more quickly just by pulling the trigger over and over. The US government bought a lot of Star revolvers during the Civil War. It was a futuristic idea, and it gave soldiers a big advantage in a close-quarters fight. But here's the kicker. The trigger pull was really long and heavy, which made it hard to aim accurately. Some models even had a second trigger to fire it single-action style. It was a good idea, but it was a bit too complicated for its time. However, this American attempt at a faster-firing gun was happening at the same time a European gun with an even weirder design was making its way to the West. 7. Lefauché 1000, 858. Not all the guns of the Wild West were made in America. This one, the Lefauché, came all the way from France, and it was a strange one. Instead of regular bullets, it used something called a pinfire cartridge. This was a brass case with a little pin sticking out of the side. When the hammer hit the pin, it would set off the gunpowder inside. It was one of the first revolvers to use self-contained cartridges instead of loose powder and ball. This was a big step forward because it made reloading much faster. You just had to pop open a loading gate and stick the pinfire cartridges in. Both the Union and Confederate armies used thousands of these during the Civil War. They were a common sight on the frontier too. But that little pin was also its biggest problem. It could get bent or go off by accident if the gun was dropped. It was a good idea, but a more reliable kind of bullet would soon take over. The next gun on our list used that new technology to create one of the most advanced revolvers of its era. 8. Merwin, Hulbert & Company Army Revolver. The Merwin Hulbert revolver might just be the coolest gun you've never heard of. It had a truly wild and unique way of reloading that was unlike anything else. Instead of breaking open on a hinge like a Smith & Wesson, you would push a button, twist the barrel, and pull the whole front of the gun forward. As you did this, the empty casings would fall out, but any unfired bullets, which were a little longer, would be held in place. Then you could slide it back, add new bullets, twist it shut, and you were ready to go. People who owned these guns absolutely loved them. They were incredibly well made, sort of like the luxury sports cars of the revolver world. They were strong, accurate, and some say even better than a Colt or a Smith & Wesson. So why aren't they more famous? Well, they were very expensive, and the company eventually went out of business. But if you were a wealthy lawman or outlaw, this was the high-tech choice. While this gun was fancy, our next revolver was all about simplicity, designed for soldiers who needed a tough and tiny backup weapon. 9. Smith & Wesson Model 1. The Smith & Wesson Model 1 was a tiny little thing, but it was a true game changer. It was the very first revolver to use a rimfire cartridge, the kind of bullet we still use in some guns today. This little gun was not very powerful at all. It fired a tiny bullet that was not much good for a real stand-up fight, but it wasn't meant for that. This was a backup gun, a last-ditch weapon you could hide in a vest pocket. During the Civil War, soldiers on both sides bought these with their own money to carry as a secret weapon. It was perfect for that. It was small, easy to hide, and because it used cartridges, it was super easy to reload. This little revolver started a revolution in firearms. It showed everyone that the future was in cartridge-firing guns. But its small size and lack of power meant there was still a huge need for a full-sized military revolver, a need that our next gun filled perfectly. 10. Colt 1000, 860 Army. Before the Peacemaker became the king, The Colt 1860 Army was the main handgun of the U.S. military. It was the evolution of the earlier dragoons and navies. It had the power of a bigger gun but was built on a lighter frame, making it easier to handle. It had graceful, flowing lines and was known for being a very reliable and accurate weapon. For a decade, this was the standard by which all other revolvers were judged. Thousands upon thousands of these were used in the Civil War. After the war, many of these surplus guns went west with soldiers who were heading out to find their fortune. It was a cap-and-ball revolver, meaning you still had to load powder and a lead ball separately, but many of them were later converted to fire cartridges. It was a true classic that bridged the gap between the old ways and the new, but an old rival of Colt's was making a gun that some shooters swore was even better. 11. Remington 1858, New Model Army. When you talk about the big revolvers of the Civil War era, there are two names that always come up: Colt and Remington. The Remington 1858 was the Colt 1860's biggest competitor, and it had one feature that many people thought made it superior. The Remington had a solid frame, with a strap of metal over the top of the cylinder. A Colt, on the other hand, had an open-top design. That top strap made the Remington stronger and more durable. Another cool feature was that you could easily swap out the cylinder. A soldier could carry extra cylinders that were already loaded. If they ran out of ammunition in a fight, they could just drop the empty cylinder and pop in a fresh one in just a few seconds. It was a much faster way to get back into the action. Buffalo Bill Cody famously carried a Remington 1858 for many years. It was a tough, rugged gun for a tough, rugged time. But while these big guns were great for soldiers, what about regular folks who just wanted a small gun for protection? 12. Colt 1849 Pocket. Not everyone on the frontier was a gunfighter. Many people were shopkeepers, bankers, or travelers who just wanted a little something to protect themselves. For them, the massive army revolvers were just too much. That's where the Colt 1849 Pocket model came in. It was one of the most successful guns Colt ever made. They produced hundreds of thousands of them. It was small, light, and easy to conceal. It was not a very powerful weapon, but it was a lot better than nothing. It was the kind of gun a person might carry while traveling on a stagecoach, or that a shopkeeper might keep under the counter. Its small size and huge popularity meant that it was everywhere in the Old West. It was a reminder that not all dangerous guns were big. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is the one you don't see coming. But an even smaller and more notorious type of gun was about to hit the streets, and it earned a very specific, very tough nickname. 13. Forehand and Wadsworth British Bulldog. Here is a gun with a great name, the British Bulldog. This was a type of small, solid-frame, double-action revolver. Even though the name says British, they were made by lots of different companies in America and Europe. They were short, stubby, and fired a big, heavy bullet. What they lacked in accuracy, they made up for with pure stopping power at close range. These were not target pistols. These were meant for up-close and personal business. The Bulldog became very popular because it was a perfect concealed weapon. It was small enough to hide in a coat pocket, but powerful enough to end a fight quickly. It was cheap too, so almost anyone could afford one. One of the most famous, or maybe infamous, uses of a Bulldog revolver was in 1881 when a man used one to bring down President James A. Garfield. It was a small gun that left a huge mark on history. But while the Bulldog was known for being short and fat, our next gun took a totally different approach to getting more shots off quickly. 14. LeMat Revolver. If the pepper box was a weird idea, the LeMat revolver was a wild one. This gun was a true beast. On the outside, it looked like a fairly normal, if large, cap-and-ball revolver. It had a 9-shot cylinder, which was already more than the usual 6. But here is the crazy part. Right in the middle of that cylinder was a second, separate barrel. And that barrel was a shotgun. That's right. It was a revolver and a shotgun all in one. The shooter could choose to fire a regular bullet from the cylinder, or by flicking a switch on the hammer, they could fire a blast of buckshot from the shotgun barrel. It was designed by a doctor from New Orleans and became a favorite weapon of high-ranking Confederate officers during the Civil War. It was the ultimate surprise weapon. Imagine thinking your opponent is out of bullets, only to be met with a shotgun blast. While the LeMat was all about a shocking surprise, our next gun was known for being incredibly tough and reliable, a true soldier's friend. 15. Rogers and Spencer Revolver. The Rogers and Spencer revolver has a bit of a sad story. It was one of the best-made, most rugged, and most reliable cap-and-ball revolvers of its time. It had a solid frame like the Remington, making it very strong. It was accurate and had a really smooth action. By all accounts, it was a fantastic weapon. The U.S. government thought so too, and they ordered thousands of them near the end of the Civil War. But here's the thing. By the time the company started delivering these great revolvers, the war was already over. So the Army just put them all into storage. They were brand new, top-of-the-line guns that never got used. Years later, they were sold off as surplus for very cheap. Many of them ended up in the hands of frontiersmen who knew a good deal when they saw one. It was a high-quality gun that became a bargain for the cowboys of the West. From a top-quality American gun, let's jump across the ocean to another tough design from Great Britain. 16. Adams Revolver. Long before Colt and Smith & Wesson were the kings, a British gunmaker named Robert Adams made a name for himself. The Adams revolver of 1851 was a major breakthrough. It was one of the very first successful double-action revolvers. Unlike the clumsy Star revolver we talked about earlier, the Adams was well made and its action was much smoother. You could fire it quickly just by pulling the trigger. This gave British officers a big advantage over enemies who were still using single-action guns. A famous story tells of a British officer in India who found himself in a tough spot against multiple attackers. He was able to defend himself because his Adams revolver could fire so much faster than their single-shot pistols. Colt himself was very dismissive of the double-action design, calling it silly. But the Adams revolver proved him wrong and showed that a faster rate of fire was the way of the future. Another British design also became famous, but for very different reasons. 17. Tranter Revolver. William Tranter was another one of the great British gun designers. His revolvers were a bit strange, but very clever. He made several different models, but his most famous ones had a weird double trigger system. There were two triggers inside the trigger guard. The bottom one would cock the hammer and rotate the cylinder. The top one would then fire the gun. A shooter could use both triggers for a careful, aimed shot, or they could just pull both at the same time to fire quickly in a double-action style. It was a complex system, but people who used it, like the famous African explorer Allan Quatermain from adventure novels, swore by it. Tranter's guns were very well made and powerful. They were another example of the advanced designs coming out of Europe that eventually made their way to the American frontier, often in the hands of immigrants or wealthy travelers who wanted the latest and greatest technology. But back in America, companies were trying to make their own fast-shooting guns with a design that looked like a bolt of lightning. 18. Colt Lightning. After years of making only single-action revolvers, the Colt company finally realized they needed to compete with the double-action guns from companies like Smith & Wesson. Their answer was the Colt Lightning. It was a sleek, medium-framed, double-action revolver. It was famous for its very fast action. A skilled shooter could fire all 6 shots in just a couple of seconds. It got its name because it was as fast as lightning. The Lightning became popular with some lawmen and outlaws who valued speed above all else. Billy the Kid was known to carry a Colt Lightning, but it had a dark side. The internal mechanism was very complicated and delicate, with lots of tiny springs and parts. It was known to break easily, and it was very difficult to repair. It was a fast gun for sure, but not nearly as reliable as the old Peacemaker. Colt made another version of this gun, a big brother that packed a much bigger punch. 19. Colt Thunderer. If the Colt Lightning was the fast one, the Colt Thunderer was the powerful one. It was basically the same gun as the Lightning, with the same fast double-action mechanism, but it was built on a bigger frame and fired a much larger and more powerful bullet. The idea was to have a gun with the speed of the Lightning but the stopping power of the Peacemaker. Like its little brother, the Thunderer was known for being fast, but also for being fragile. Famous lawman Bat Masterson ordered one, but he reportedly didn't like it much. The complicated guts of the gun just couldn't hold up to the recoil of the powerful ammunition. It was another case of a good idea that didn't quite work out in practice. It showed that making a reliable double-action revolver was a lot harder than it looked. But that didn't stop Colt's old rival from trying to perfect their own design. 20. Remington Model 1875. When Colt's Peacemaker came out in 1873, it was a massive hit. The Remington Company knew they needed an answer to it, and that answer was the Model 1875. It looked a lot like the Peacemaker, but it had one key difference that was a classic Remington feature. It had a web of metal under the barrel, something that the old 1858 model had. This made the gun look very distinct, and, some said, made it a bit stronger. The Model 1875 was a good, solid, reliable gun. It worked well and was just as powerful as the Colt. But it had one big problem. It came out 2 years after the Colt. By that time, the Peacemaker was already super popular, and the U.S. Army had already given Colt a big contract. Remington was late to the party. Even though they made a great gun, they had a hard time catching up. The famous outlaw Frank James carried a Remington 1875. It was a great six-shooter, but it was always living in the shadow of the Peacemaker.